His name was Titan, and the name was a warning. He was a mountain of muscle and fury, a 2,000-pound storm of Chianina bull, whose white coat was a canvas for the dirt and rage he carried like a shroud. On the quiet plains of the Bar T Ranch, every other creature moved with the rhythm of the seasons, but Titan moved with the rhythm of a war drum only he could hear. He was a prisoner in the strongest paddock on the property, his world defined by 6-inch steel posts and reinforced fencing that still seemed to groan under the weight of his anger. No one could approach. Not the seasoned ranch hands with their quiet confidence, not the veterinarian with her tranquilizer gun, and certainly not Mark, the man who owned him. Titan's rage was a physical force, a wall of hostility so absolute it felt like a heat shimmer in the air around his enclosure. He was a lost cause, a tragedy waiting for its final bloody chapter. The final call had been made. He was too dangerous, a liability that could no longer be contained. In 3 days, the vet would return, not with a sedative, but with a final, merciful solution. But then, something impossible happened. From the farmhouse, a small figure emerged, moving with a halting, unsteady gait. It was Mark's son, 10-year-old Leo, a boy encased in his own silence, his body bound by braces that helped him stand, but could not help him run. He was everything Titan was not: small, fragile, and quiet. And he was walking directly toward the fence, toward the epicenter of the ranch's fear. Everyone knew the rule. You don't just stay away from Titan's pen, you pretend it doesn't exist. But Leo, with a gaze as steady as the northern star, was breaking that rule. And no one could have predicted what would happen when the boy, who could barely stand, reached out to touch the beast that no one dared to face. Leo's world was a landscape of limitations. Born with cerebral palsy, his muscles were in a constant state of argument with his intentions. Simple movements, like walking across the living room or holding a glass of water, were monumental efforts of will, a negotiation between mind and body that often left him exhausted and frustrated. His voice was a whisper trapped behind a locked door, the words forming perfectly in his mind but emerging as soft, breathy sounds that the world, in its haste, often missed. To many, Leo was defined by the things he could not do. He couldn't run with the other kids, couldn't shout for joy, couldn't ride a horse like his father, Mark. He was a spectator to the life that galloped on around him. His existence was a quiet one, spent mostly in a worn armchair by the large farmhouse window, his gaze fixed on the sprawling land his family had worked for generations. From this vantage point, he saw everything. He saw the subtle language of the horses, the nervous flick of an ear, the gentle nuzzle that spoke of reassurance. He saw the way the barn cats navigated their complex social hierarchies with a silent flick of a tail. He didn't just see animals. He felt their frequencies. In their silent world, he was not an outsider. He was fluent. His father, Mark, was a man carved from the same tough earth as the ranch. He was practical, strong, his hands calloused from work and his heart calloused by grief. Leo's mother had passed away when he was just a toddler, leaving a void in the farmhouse that Mark tried to fill with routine and overprotection. He loved his son with a fierce, aching tenderness, but his love often manifested as fear. He saw danger everywhere: a loose floorboard, a coming storm, a stray dog. And most of all, he saw it in the form of Titan, the monstrous bull raging at the far end of his property. The paddock was a monument to Mark's one great failure, a mistake he was reminded of with every furious snort that carried on the wind. For Leo, however, that distant, furious shape was not a failure. It was a mystery. It was a kindred spirit. From his window, he watched Titan for hours. He saw past the thrashing horns and the violent charges at the fence. He saw the loneliness. He saw the way the massive bull would sometimes stand perfectly still, head hung low, facing the sunset, as if mourning the dying light. In Titan's powerful, trapped body, Leo saw a reflection of his own. A spirit yearning for freedom, a heart misunderstood, a voice that couldn't be heard. The boy in the window and the bull in the pen were two islands of silence in a whirl of noise, separated by 100 yards of pasture, but connected by an invisible thread of shared solitude. Titan hadn't been born a monster. He was a product of cruelty, a masterpiece of trauma sculpted by a heartless hand. Mark had bought him at an auction 2 years prior, not because he needed another bull, but because he couldn't bear to watch what was happening. Titan, then just a yearling, was part of a bankrupt breeder's stock, and the man handling him was a brute. He used an electric prod, not for guidance, but for punishment, delighting in the animal's terrified reactions. Mark saw the young bull's spirit, a flicker of proud Chianina fire, being systematically extinguished and replaced with something dark and defensive. In a moment of what he later called foolish compassion, he outbid everyone, determined to give the animal a peaceful life. He brought him home, hoping the open pastures and gentle rhythms of the bar tea would heal the scars. He was wrong. The trauma was already too deep. Titan associated every human hand with pain, every approach with a threat. He remembered the sting of electricity, the harsh shouts, the metallic taste of fear. His mind had built a fortress around itself, and the only weapon it knew was rage. His paddock, initially meant to be a temporary space for acclimation, became a permanent prison. He grew larger, stronger, and more volatile. He shattered water troughs, charged the feed truck, and once bent a steel gate with a single, terrifying headbutt. Evans, the local vet, had been clear from the start. "This isn't just aggression, Mark," she'd said, her voice grim as she watched Titan from a safe distance. "This is neurological. The abuse has rewired him. He's living in a constant state of fight or flight. He doesn't see you, he sees the ghost of the man who hurt him." She was the supportive expert, the voice of reason, but her reason pointed toward a heartbreaking conclusion. Mark, however, couldn't bring himself to do it. Every time he looked at Titan, he saw the ghost of his own failure. He had meant to save him, but he had only managed to cage him. It was a mirror to his life with Leo. He wanted to give his son a world of freedom, but instead, he had built a fortress of protection around him. He felt trapped by the same love and responsibility that drove him, and so, he kept Titan, feeding him from the back of the pickup, reinforcing the fences, and praying for a miracle he didn't believe in. The bull was a living, breathing symbol of his inability to fix what was broken, a 2,000-pound reminder of the limits of good intentions. Leo's quiet observation began to evolve into a silent ritual. Every day, after his morning physical therapy exercises left his muscles aching and his spirit weary, he would make his way to the back porch. He would sit there for hours, his small frame dwarfed by the vastness of the landscape, his eyes locked on the distant white form of Titan. His father saw it as a strange, passive fixation, but it was anything but passive. For Leo, this was school. It was church. It was a conversation held across a great distance. He learned to read the bull's moods in the subtle shift of his weight, the flick of his tail, the angle of his head. He saw the difference between the explosive rage directed at the feed truck and the deeper, quieter anger that came from a place of profound sorrow. He started bringing things with him. An apple, polished and perfect, which he would set on the porch railing as an offering. A small, smooth stone he'd found by the creek, which he held in his hand as if it could transmit his own calm energy across the field. His world, which had often felt so small and constrained, expanded to include the bull's paddock. The fence became more than just a physical barrier. It was a potent symbol. For Mark, it represented safety and containment, the line between order and chaos. For Leo, it was the painful demarcation between two lonely souls. He longed to cross it, not with the bravado of a daredevil, but with the quiet purpose of a diplomat on a mission of peace. Mark's anxiety grew with each passing day. "Leo, stay away from there," he'd say, his voice tight with a fear he tried to mask as authority. "He's not a pet. He's dangerous." Leo would just nod, his expressive eyes conveying an understanding that went far beyond his father's words. He understood the danger, but he also understood the pain, and to him, the pain was the greater of the two. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled in, fast and violent. The sky turned a bruised purple, and rain fell in blinding sheets. From the living room window, they watched as Titan, agitated by the crashing thunder and flashing lightning, became a whirlwind of panic. He charged the fence again and again, his bellows of terror mixing with the roar of the storm. One of the steel posts, the one nearest the farmhouse, buckled. It didn't break, but it bent at a sickening angle, a wound in the armor that was supposed to keep them all safe. The sight sent a chill down Mark's spine. The illusion of control was shattered. The fence was not invincible. The danger was not contained. It was a single bent post, but it was enough to sign Titan's death warrant. The next morning, the air was clean and calm, scrubbed fresh by the storm. But inside the farmhouse, a different kind of storm was brewing. Dr. Evans stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of sympathy and unyielding firmness. The bent post was the final straw. "Mark, we're out of options," she said, her voice low but resolute. "That fence is the only thing between him and, well, anything. A delivery driver, a neighbor, Leo. What happens when it's not a post that bends, but a gate that breaks? You can't live with that risk. I can't let you." Mark slumped into a kitchen chair, the weight of the decision crushing him. He looked out the window at the bull, who was now standing quietly, as if exhausted by his own terror. He saw the beauty in him, the magnificent form, the proud lineage, but he also saw the bent post. He saw the liability. He saw the face of his son. His voice was barely a whisper. "When?" Dr. Evans placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'll come back Friday morning. It will be quick. He won't feel a thing." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A verdict delivered, a life measured and found wanting. From the hallway, hidden in the shadows just beyond the kitchen doorway, Leo listened. He didn't understand all the words, liability, neurological, euthanize, but he understood the tone. He understood the finality in Dr. Evans' voice and the sound of his father's heart breaking. He understood Friday morning. He understood that time was running out for the lonely king in the field. A profound and terrible clarity settled over him. For his entire life, he had been the one cared for, protected, shielded. Others made decisions for him, anticipating his needs, guarding him from a world that wasn't built for his body. But in that moment, listening to the death sentence of the only creature he felt truly understood him, something shifted deep within his soul. The passive observer died, and a hero, small and uncertain, was born. He knew what he had to do. The thought was terrifying, a jolt of fear so powerful it made his legs tremble. But beneath the fear was a current of conviction, fierce and bright. He had to reach Titan. He had to tell him, in the only language they both shared, that he was not alone. Have you ever felt a purpose so clear, so absolute, that it dwarfed every fear, every doubt, every voice telling you it was impossible? That was the fire that now burned in Leo's heart. Friday morning arrived with a soft, hazy sunrise, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of rose and gold. It felt like a mockery, this gentle beauty on a day marked for death. Mark was quiet, his movements slow and heavy as he prepared breakfast, his mind 1,000 miles away. He didn't notice that Leo barely touched his food. He didn't notice the look of unshakable resolve in his son's eyes. While his father was on the phone with Dr. Evans, confirming the terrible appointment, Leo acted. He slipped out the back door, his leg braces making soft, rhythmic clicks on the wooden porch steps. It was a sound Mark usually heard from anywhere on the property, a parental radar tuned to his son's every move. But today, his grief was a fog, dulling his senses. Leo moved with a determination that seemed to lend his uncooperative limbs a new grace. He didn't go toward the main gate of the paddock. He went to the far side, near the creek, where a section of the fence was older, the wire more rusted. He had watched the ranch hands repair it a dozen times. He knew where they kept a pair of wire cutters in the small, weathered shed nearby. His hands, which often struggled to hold a fork, were surprisingly steady as he worked the tool. The metal was tough, and it took all of his strength, his small body straining with the effort. Finally, with a sharp snap, one strand of wire gave way, then another. He pulled the wires apart just enough to create a small opening, a wound in the fence just big enough for him to squeeze through. He was inside. The world on this side of the fence felt different. The air was thicker, charged with a wild energy. The ground felt softer, more alive. He could smell the damp earth, the sweet scent of clover, and the powerful, musky scent of the bull. Titan was at the far end of the enclosure, near the water trough, his back to Leo. He was a silent, white mountain against the green field. Leo took his first step, then another. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and hope. He wasn't thinking about the horns, or the weight, or the rage. He was only thinking of the loneliness. Back at the house, Mark hung up the phone. A sudden, chilling silence filled the kitchen. The rhythmic click-clack of Leo's braces was gone. "Leo?" he called out, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He scanned the living room, the porch, empty. Then his eyes were drawn to the window, to the far paddock. And what he saw stopped his heart. He saw a small opening in the fence line. And he saw his son, his fragile, vulnerable son, halfway across the field, walking steadily toward the most dangerous animal he had ever known. Mark's mind went blank with a terror so pure and absolute it stole the air from his lungs. For a moment, he was paralyzed, frozen in the kitchen, his hand still on the phone. The world outside the window warped into a surreal, slow-motion nightmare. Every rational thought screamed run, shout, distract it, but his body wouldn't obey. He was a statue of fear, watching the two most vulnerable beings in his life on a collision course. He saw Leo, so small, so determined, each step a testament to a courage Mark couldn't comprehend. And he saw Titan, a monolith of unpredictable power. The bull still hadn't moved. He hadn't seen the boy yet. Mark finally broke free from his paralysis, a strangled cry ripping from his throat. He burst out the door, his boots pounding on the hard-packed dirt, but he knew he was too far away. He wouldn't make it in time. He could only watch. He ran, shouting Leo's name, his voice hoarse with panic. The sound, sharp and desperate, finally reached the bull. Titan's head snapped up. His whole body went rigid. He turned, and for the first time, he saw the small figure approaching him. A low growl rumbled in his massive chest. His tail began to twitch, a sure sign of agitation. He lowered his head, the tips of his formidable horns glinting in the morning sun. He pawed at the ground, sending a spray of dirt into the air. This was the prelude to a charge, the terrifying ritual Mark had witnessed 100 times. But Leo didn't stop. He didn't flinch. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the bull's eyes. It was as if he were in a bubble, deaf to his father's frantic shouts, blind to the signs of impending violence. He saw only the fear in Titan's gaze, a reflection of his own. He raised a hand, not in defense, but in greeting. A soft, breathy sound escaped his lips. Not a word, but a tone. A note of pure, undiluted empathy. He was now just a few feet away, standing in the shadow of the beast, a lamb before a lion. Mark stumbled to a halt at the paddock fence, his hands gripping the wire, his knuckles white. This was it. The final, horrifying chapter he had always feared. The world narrowed to that single, impossible scene. The raging bull, the fragile boy, and the space between them that was about to close in an explosion of violence. Time seemed to bend and stretch. The frantic beating of Mark's heart was the only sound in the universe. Titan's muscles were coiled, a spring of 2,000 pounds of power ready to be unleashed. The air crackled with tension. And then Leo did the impossible. He closed the final few feet of distance, stood directly in front of the colossal animal, and looked up into its dark, stormy eyes. He reached out his small, trembling hands. He didn't touch the bull's horns or his powerful head. He reached for his neck, for the thick, muscular expanse below his jaw, and he hugged him. He pressed his small cheek against the bull's coarse, warm hide, his arms barely reaching a quarter of the way around the massive neck. He closed his eyes and poured every ounce of his own lonely, silent existence into that one, simple, world-shattering gesture. It was an act of such radical trust, such insane bravery, that it broke through the fortress of rage. For a heartbeat, Titan remained rigid, a statue of disbelief. The deep, guttural growl in his chest hitched. His tail stopped twitching. The fury in his eyes, a fire that had burned for 2 long years, flickered. It was replaced by something else. Confusion. Curiosity. And then, something akin to wonder. The massive head, which could shatter steel, lowered just an inch. The body, which could overturn a truck, seemed to soften. A long, shuddering breath escaped the bull's enormous nostrils, a sound not of anger, but of release. It was a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 days of fear and pain. He didn't move away. He didn't recoil. He leaned into the hug. He pressed his immense weight gently, carefully, against the small, frail boy, as if seeking comfort himself. From the fence line, Mark watched, tears streaming down his face, his mind unable to process what his eyes were seeing. The monster was gone. In its place was just an animal, a lonely, wounded creature, who had just been offered the one thing it had never known: compassion without fear. The boy who couldn't speak had said everything. The boy who could barely stand had shouldered the immense weight of another's pain and, in doing so, had healed them both. The sun broke free from the morning haze, bathing the scene in a warm golden light, as if nature itself were blessing the miracle. The spell was broken by the sound of Dr. Evans' truck pulling up the long gravel driveway. She got out, her face etched with a somber resolve for the task ahead, but stopped dead in her tracks when she saw the scene in the paddock. Her jaw fell open. There was Mark, weeping silently at the fence. And there, in the middle of the field, was Leo, now sitting on the ground, his back resting against the side of the placidly lying Titan, his hand stroking the bull's massive head. Titan's eyes were closed, a picture of absolute tranquility. He was no longer a storm. He was an island of peace. Dr. Evans walked slowly to the fence, her medical bag forgotten in the truck. She stared, her scientific, logical mind struggling to find a framework for the impossible sight before her. "Mark, what? How?" she stammered. Mark just shook his head, a laugh mixing with his sobs. "I have no idea," he said, his voice thick with awe. He just hugged him. From that day forward, everything changed. Titan was not a new bull. He was the bull he was always meant to be before the world had broken him. The rage was gone, washed away by a single act of fearless love. The reinforced paddock became unnecessary. Mark eventually took down the gate, leaving it open. Titan never strayed. His world was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. And at its center was Leo. Their bond was the new rhythm of the ranch. The bull became Leo's shadow, his guardian. He would follow the boy around the property at a slow, careful pace, his massive presence a gentle shield. He would lie his head in Leo's lap, his eyes soft, as the boy read to him in his soft, whispery voice. The story spread, a piece of modern folklore whispered through the small town. People would drive by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy and his bull. But this was more than just Titan's transformation. It was Leo's. The boy who had lived in a world of silence had found his voice, not in words, but in impact. He was no longer the fragile child defined by his braces. He was Leo, the boy who spoke to animals, the one who had healed the unhealable. A new confidence bloomed in him. He walked taller, his steps more certain. He had discovered his own unique power, the strength of gentleness, the courage of empathy. He had faced down the biggest monster on the ranch and found not a beast, but a friend. And in doing so, he had faced down his own limitations and found they were no match for the size of his heart. The Barty Ranch was no longer just a place of cattle and crops. It became a place of pilgrimage for those who felt broken or misunderstood. Mark, inspired by his son, began a small, informal program for children with special needs, allowing them to interact with the gentler animals on the ranch. He had spent years trying to fix what was broken with strength and steel, only to learn from his 10-year-old son that the most powerful tool of all was a gentle touch. The story of Leo and Titan became a parable, a living lesson in the power of looking beyond the surface. It was a reminder that behind the most terrifying displays of anger often lies the deepest pain, and that the strongest fences are not made of steel, but of fear and misunderstanding. Dr. Evans would often visit, not as a vet, but as a friend, simply to watch the two of them together. She called it her dose of faith. She realized that some things couldn't be explained by neurology or science, but only by the mysterious and powerful alchemy of connection. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the pasture, Mark found Leo and Titan by the creek. The boy was leaning against the bull's side, his small hand resting on Titan's neck, watching the sky blaze with orange and purple. The day was ending, just as it had every other day. But this sunset felt different. It wasn't an ending, it was a promise. It was the symbol of a peace that had been hard won, not through struggle, but through surrender, not through force, but through love. Titan, once the incarnation of a furious storm, was now the embodiment of a deep and abiding calm. He had become what Leo had always seen in him, a gentle giant, a guardian, a friend. And Leo, the boy who had been a prisoner of his own body, had found a profound freedom in his ability to liberate another. He had taught everyone around him that the greatest disability is not a body that won't cooperate, but a heart that refuses to connect. He proved that sometimes the only medicine required is the courage to offer a hug when everyone else is building a fence.